So moving ahead to the next example, that is example number 2. It says consider a dividend paying stock and investment horizon of 4 years. Year end 1, 2, 3, 4, they have given you the dividend and share price. Similar kind of information what we have seen in the earlier example. Now here it says the client, Mr. John, has initially purchased 100 shares at the beginning of year 1 when the share price was $200 each. At end of year 2, he purchased another 800 shares. At the end of year 3, he sold 750 shares. Determine the following: individual HPRs for each of the 4 years and HPR for the entire 4 years. Then TWRR and MWRR. So let us do one thing. Let us take up the basic calculations first. That is the calculations of HPR. I don't think I need to explain this part to you at all. You know that very clearly. HPR for year 1 is 20%. HPR for year 2 is 25%. HPR for year 3 is 68% and HPR for year 4 is negative 20%. So please write up this calculation and then I explain you with detailed analysis. Alright friends, you would have completed this entire calculation. Now time for you to understand some important factors before we move ahead. Can you notice something over here? In the entire investment horizon of 4 years, year 1 and year 2 have fetched some usual normal rate of return. Year 3 has given exceptionally a very high rate of return, and year 4 went into a stage of loss where the returns are negative. Correct? Now, what did our client do over here? The client has pumped in big amount of money by purchasing some additional shares at what time? At end of year 2. When end of year 2 someone is purchasing a big chunk of shares, these will be the initial investment for the 3rd year, and 3rd year has generated very high rate of return, 68%. By end of 3rd year the share price also is considerably high. Mr. John, the client, he has decided to sell a good number of shares by end of 3rd year. As a result, 4th year is the year of loss or negative returns, but by default the participation in that loss by weight declines because in the 4th year the client has very small quantity of shares left over. As a result, your money weighted rate of return will get influenced by all these additional investment and withdrawals on sale of shares, whereas time weighted rate of return will have nothing to do with that. So let me take you ahead with the calculations further and show you one thing very importantly, that HPR for 4 years entire period will be simply first year factor 1.20, second year factor 1.25, third year factor 1.68 because there was a high rate of return, and fourth year the factor is less than 1 because the rate of return was negative. So when you take 1 plus HPR for 4th year, it is basically 1 plus negative 0.2, that makes it 0.8. From the product of these 4 factors you subtract 1 to arrive at the HPR for the 4-year holding period. That will come to what? 2.0160 minus 1, it will be 1.0160. That means your overall holding period return for 4 years is 101.60%. So now if you notice, what is the difference between HPR and TWRR? When you are computing TWRR, you are taking the product of the same 4 factors, but you are taking geometric mean. Because you are multiplying 4 factors, you are taking the product raised to 1 by 4 and then you are subtracting 1. So the factors product when raised to 1 by 4, it will give the periodic effect, and the returns what you compute will be a kind of per annum returns. The per annum returns in this case is 19.16%. Alternative approach, if HPR was not required, I have explained to you this direct approach in the previous example itself. If HPR was not required in the example, then you could have done the calculation this way and you would obtain the same result, that is 19.16%. So 19.16% is the time weighted rate of return. Please write up this entire calculation and then I take you ahead. Alright friends, once you have completed writing this entire working, let us move ahead for computing the last part, that will be the money weighted rate of return. But for that we need to determine all cash inflows and cash outflows. So in the 0 year, our client Mr. John, he has purchased 100 shares, each one priced as $200. So there will be cash outflow of $20,000 at 0 year. During year 1, there was no investment or withdrawal as such made, but there was definitely some dividend receipt which will be a cash inflow. On each share the dividend amount was $20. So cash inflow for the first year will be $2,000. During the second year, the dividend per share was $25, which will be received on 100 shares. That comes to $2,500 as inflow. But Mr. John has purchased 800 shares at the year end price of $250. That will cause a big amount of cash outflow. So 800 into 250 will be the outflow, and this dividend amount will be the inflow. The net outcome of that thing will be a negative cash flow, which indicates a big amount of outflow, $197,500 as a negative cash flow or outflow. Now what happened in the third year? In the third year, the dividend will be received on 100 original shares plus 800 new shares purchased. Dividend will be received on 900 shares at the rate of $20. So 900 shares into $20, $18,000 will be the dividend cash flow or dividend cash inflow. On the other side, Mr. John has sold 750 shares, each at $400. As a result, 750 into 400 will also be a cash inflow. 750 into 400 will give you $300,000 and 900 into 20 will give you $18,000. So total cash inflow at third year will be $318,000. And then in the fourth year, there were no changes. So how many shares Mr. John is left over with? He already had 900 shares. He has sold 750 shares. So he is remaining with 150 shares. On those 150 shares, he will receive a $20 dividend plus the sale price at end of the fourth year is $300. And finally, the cash flow comes to $48,000 as cash inflow. Please take note of these cash inflows and outflows before we go into the MWRR calculation. Alright friends, once you have completed writing this whole thing, we will be computing the IRR now. So MWRR or IRR. Let us first set the equation. You know one thing, all cash flows when transformed to their present values, that is all cash inflows and cash outflows when transformed to their present values, where the discounting rate is the IRR itself, the resulting NPV will be 0. That is why in the left side of the equation we have placed a 0. Let us now substitute all the cash flows. What we just need to determine is that small r in this equation that is resembling IRR. All cash flows have been plotted. I want you all to pick your calculator and do the IRR calculation along with me. So it is a 4-year investment horizon. turn on your calculator and press CF for cash flow based calculation. Without failure, to wipe off the old working of cash flows, press second and CEC for clearing the work done in the past. Now, CF0 is demanded. It is outflow, that is a negative cash flow of $20,000. So I take 20,000 negative as input, press enter and press the downward arrow key once. It is now demanding the cash flow of year 1, which is $2,000 positive. So 2000 will be the input, press enter, downward arrow key twice. Second year cash flow, again a net amount of outflow, a net negative cash flow, that is $197,500 with a negative sign, that you should input as your cash flow for second year, that is negative 197,500 and press enter, press the downward arrow key twice. Third year cash flow is a big amount of positive cash flow, that is $318,000. So 318,000 is the input, then press enter, press the downward arrow key twice. The last year cash flow is $48,000. So input 48,000, press enter, downward arrow key twice. It is asking fifth year cash flow. There is no fifth year cash flow involved. So press IRR, that is what you want to compute, and then press CPT for compute, and you will be surprised with that result, where the time weighted rate of return we got around 19% something. The money weighted rate of return is coming to what? 47.33%, and that is what appearing on the screen as well, 47.33%. I am sure along with me when you have made the calculation you would have got 47.33%. The question is, why such a big amount of IRR? Why such a big value of IRR? 47.33%. Because this calculation MWRR is getting influenced by cash inflows and cash outflows made by the client. Now, third year was the year of peak returns and fourth year was the year of negative returns. Just before the beginning of third year, the client has invested a big amount of money, and that is increasing the money weight for third year cash flow. On the other side, fourth year generated negative returns, but just at end of third year, the client has withdrawn a big amount of money by selling shares. So the money weight for the fourth year was reduced drastically. As a result, because of the changes in the weights, the positive weight accompanied by a very high returns in the third year and a very low weight for a negative return in the fourth year is not letting your money weighted rate of return go down. You are having a considerable high rate of return. Now here is the catch. We were talking about evaluating the performance of the portfolio manager. Now imagine Mr. John in this example, who is the client. It is in the hands of Mr. John when to invest and when to withdraw. The portfolio manager has no role to play. In that case, because of the influence of this kind of investment and withdrawal action by the client Mr. John, the portfolio manager's performance, if you are evaluating through MWRR, it gets influenced unnecessarily, it is getting biased, and therefore MWRR is not suitable in that scenario. However, if the portfolio manager was given liberty, that Mr. John, who is the client, he tells portfolio manager that you see, you tell me when to buy, when to sell. I am not going to tell you when I will put in money, when I will withdraw money. I will give you money as and when you demand, you decide. In that case, look at one thing, maybe the portfolio manager would have assessed that third year is going to give a high return and he would have emphasized the client, Mr. John, to invest a big amount of money at the beginning of third year or maybe at end of second year, and withdraw a big chunk of money by end of third year, so that you are not participating in that loss with a high weight. In that case, if the timing of the cash flow as well as the decision about where to invest and how much to invest, all the decisions are at the liberty of the portfolio manager, then MWRR is the appropriate means for evaluating the performance of the portfolio manager. Then definitely portfolio manager should be appraised for generating such a high rate of return for the entire investment horizon of 4 years. Correct? And keep in mind one thing, this is a per annum return. It is on an average a per annum return of 47.33%. Later on you can look into how much money the client has put in and how much money he has got back. You would see what kind of monetary gain the client would have made. Just imagine if the cash inflow, cash outflow action was little different. Imagine what would happen when a major chunk of money was withdrawn at the end of second year, where in the third year the rate of return, which is considerably high, but if the money weight gets reduced, what will happen? The impact of the money weight getting reduced, your advantage of third year high rate of return will not be reflected in MWRR. And imagine what would happen when at the end of third year the client has put in a big chunk of money, where in the fourth year the rate of return is negative. So at the end of third year, if you are putting more money and fourth year is generating a negative return, you are participating in loss with a big money weight. Your MWRR will be affected adversely. But even in that scenario, if the share price and dividend figures remain the same, your TWRR calculation will not be influenced. So, conclusion what we draw conceptually over here, if the performance of the portfolio manager is to be assessed, which measure should be adopted, TWRR or MWRR? The answer will be subjective. If the portfolio manager is responsible only to manage the portfolio, but all the decisions of when to put in money and when to withdraw money is in the hands of the client, then money weighted rate of return is not appropriate. TWRR, that is time weighted rate of return, will be a better measure. However, when the entire management of funds is with the portfolio manager, then MWRR will be appropriate measure for evaluating the performance of portfolio manager. Let me do one thing now. The altered scenario that I was talking about, if I put it in the form of an example and if I ask you to make the calculation, I'll give you sufficient time to analyze and do all the calculations. But the true test is, are you able to make those calculations on your own? So let me put you at some important task over here. A similar example but with a little different scenario I'm putting over here as example 3. You would notice that the initial data is same what was given to you in example 2. If the initial data is same, the dividend, share price, all information same, investment horizon 4 years, you know what will happen when the question is asking you to determine HPR for individual 4 years and then entire HPR for the 4-year holding period. HPR will not be affected because HPR has nothing to do with all these purchase and sale decisions, and therefore TWRR will also not get influenced. I have given you a hint actually, okay, but anyway, look at this paragraph over here, which is different from that previous example. The client Miss Lily has initially purchased 1000 shares at the beginning of year 1 when the share price was $200 each. At the end of year 2, she sold 800 shares At the end of year 3, she purchased another 600 shares. Now, with this kind of information, obviously what will happen? Think, this client this time has withdrawn a big chunk of money by end of second year by selling big number of shares. So the money weight gets reduced for the third year, and at the end of third year the client has again put in big amount of money by buying extra shares, and therefore big money weight will be applied for the fourth year, which is actually producing a negative return. You will be surprised with the calculation, rather I would say you will be shocked with the calculation, that all the dividend and share price information remaining same, TWRR, HPR, everything remaining same, it is MWRR that will get influenced. So what I'll do is, I will give you exactly 5 minutes time to determine all the calculations as rough work. Then you can write down the solution when I provide you the solution on the screen. So I've given you 5 minutes time, your time starts now. Alright friends, I have given you enough time and your time is over. Let us look into these calculations of HPR. As I said, HPR calculations will not be influenced by the change in this example. All your HPRs for year 1, year 2, year 3 and year 4 will still be the same as were there in the previous example. No change at all. So I would suggest you that instead of copying the whole calculation, you just mention that HPR same as in example 2. That is, you are giving the reference of the previous example. Just write one line, HPR calculations will be same as in example 2. So nothing to write over here in that case. We move forward. The HPR for the entire holding period of 4 years will also remain the same. It will not change, and TWRR will also not change. It will remain the same. If you look into the alternate approach of TWRR calculation, that is the direct approach, of course even that approach would give you the same result, and the TWRR comes to 19.16%. So you can again write one more line below that, that is TWRR calculation will remain same as in example 2, no change at all. So there is nothing to write in that case with respect to this particular calculation. What is something different in this example is about the cash inflows and cash outflows. Now this is something that I have asked you to try from your side, and you need to check whether all your calculations were correct. At the beginning of first year, that is at 0 year, the client Miss Lily has purchased 1000 shares at $200 each. So the negative cash flow will be $200,000. At the end of year 1, there was a dividend receipt at $20 per share into 1000 shares. That will be inflow of $20,000. At end of year 2, there was a cash inflow towards dividend on 1000 shares and cash inflow by sale of 800 shares. The total cash inflow at second year is $225,000, and then at end of third year there will be a receipt of dividend only on 200 shares because 800 shares were sold by the client earlier. Now dividend on 200 shares will be received, but additional investment will be made for additional 600 shares. So 600 shares into $400 will be what? $240,000, and from that you subtract $4,000 of dividend receipt. So your net cash outflow or the negative cash flow will be $236,000. At the end of fourth year, it is only the withdrawal that you have to make, that is $300 as the share price plus $20 as dividend. multiplied by 800 shares. Keep in mind one thing, there were original 1000 shares, 800 shares were sold, so remainder was 200 shares, additional 600 shares were purchased, so at the end there were 800 shares. Keeping all these cash flows into consideration, the year end cash flow, that is the fourth year cash flow, would come to $256,000. So please write up all these calculations and then I take you ahead. Alright friends, once you have completed writing these cash flow calculations, let us move ahead and compute the IRR, which will be the money weighted rate of return. Now, as I have explained in the previous example, you need to do it exactly the same. The equation remains same, only the amounts of cash flows will be different over here. The cash flows as we have computed in the previous working, those cash inflows and cash outflows you will have to consider and accordingly make the calculation of IRR, and you can check through your financial calculator. The IRR will be only 10.33%. I am not explaining you the procedure of computing this IRR because we have been doing this so many times in TVM chapter. Now it doesn't make any sense for me to just keep on repeating that explanation, where just in the previous example I have already explained to you the IRR calculation once again. So I am hoping that when you attempted the calculation on your own, you would have got the same result. If you are not getting the same result, means somewhere your practice, somewhere your understanding is still lacking. And in that case, I would emphasize that instead of proceeding ahead with the classes, you better revise and practice the content up to this stage. You should be very, very comfortable with IRR computation. That is what I have strongly recommended in the earlier classes of TVM as well. So with this whole discussion, I'll be putting an end to this particular class. In the next class, we are going to continue with taking more and more calculative examples on TWRR and MWRR. But at this point, we will be putting an end to this session. Thank you very much for attending this class.